This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A discussion about parasites in aquatic life from part of the Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast with Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken begins today's show. K-State veterinarian Gregg Hanzlicek keeps the show moving as he explains the various reasons cattle could experience a pregnancy loss. Wrapping up the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he talks about research being done to hopefully be able to move calves without causing stress or injury. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We've got aquatics up this week. So, Joe, what are we going to talk about?
We do. We're having a lot of fun. We're going to talk about parasites today, Drew. So if you're not feeling a little creepy crawly already, you're about to by the end of this episode for sure.
Well, parasites are kind of one of those nasty old things, but some parasites are pretty cool.
That's a biologist speaking right there. It is,
yeah.
We're going to be talking mostly about parasites that are in fish and aquatic animals today. So not human parasites, but still some really cool critters. Sea lampreys are one where they're living out in the ocean a lot, but they'll come into freshwater too. And so they're kind of like a little snake-looking critter. They're actually a fish, but they just like a long tubular fish, kind of look like an eel maybe.
Yeah.
But they have a circular mouth with really, kind of crazy teeth on it. And they can bite onto a fish. They'll actually grind a little hole into the fish till they can get down to the blood, and they'll eat off of that fish for a little while. So we'll see those more commonly, kind of in freshwater systems. These fish are migrating really long distances, right? And so these migration patterns, we've put up a lot of dams, so we don't see them in the middle of the country as much as maybe we historically would have. But they certainly used to be in our neck of the woods.
Wow.
Brook lamprey, smaller version of the same thing. And so these fish that are kind of grabbing onto the side, again, these are, you're not going to go see them in your backyard pond every day, but they are fish that we could have seen in freshwater settings for sure.
So, Kate, I grew up being fascinated with sharks. So you're talking about lampreys. Are lampreys the same thing as those fish that we see that kind of stick to the side of a shark, but then go off and gobble up little pieces when the shark's shaking his head and loses stuff?
Those are called remoras.
Okay.
And they kind of have a little vacuum, if you look at them, like a suction cup on their head. And so, they stick themselves to the body of that shark, and they're eating a lot of when a shark bites a fish, it's not just everything goes in its mouth. There are a lot of little pieces around.
Yeah.
So those remoras are kind of gobbling up the waste, I guess, from that shark bite. They're not directly feeding off of that shark. So lampreys are a little bit different because they are a parasite. That parasitic relationship means that there's a negative for one animal and a positive for the other. And there's no real negative for the sharks to have remoras around. Right?
Okay.
So it wouldn't be parasitic because there's not a negative effect of having those remoras there.
Interesting. So what are we going to talk about next?
The estimates are 40 to 50% of all animals, vertebrates and invertebrates that have been discovered, have some parasitic aspect to their life, right? So it's very common. This relationship is very common. This parasitic relationship is very common, and it's widespread. And a lot of time we see them in ponds too. So, I just want to point out, really common to see this across the board everywhere we're at, but also common to see them in your backyard pond.
So what kind of parasites might we see in our pond?
The most common ones that we'll see are things like yellow grubs. And so if you go catch a bass or a bluegill out of your pond, you open up their operculum and you can look and see the red of their gills. You don't ever want to touch their gills. Lots of blood vessels and really thin blood vessels. So if you touch their gills, you can really hurt them. But if you look there, you might see little white specks on those gills. If you look on their fins, a lot of times you'll see white specks. And so the most common parasite that I see in Kansas is called a yellow grub. And that's just a little parasitic fluke that gets into fish, into bodies of water, and affects the fish. You might see it when you're cutting open a fillet, little white cysts in the fish. And so that yellow grub is the most common parasite that I see around Kansas. They have a really interesting life cycle where we see them in the fish generally, but the goal of the parasite is for that fish to get eaten by a bird. And inside of the bird's digestive tract is where these parasites grow up and reproduce. So that's kind of their end host is the bird. The birds then will fly over a pond. They'll leave some droppings in the pond that have a bunch of eggs in it. Those eggs will hatch. Parasites go find a snail, and they grow up in that snail. And then when a fish eats that snail, the parasites infect that fish. That's commonly when we see them. And then that cycle continues. So that snail is called an intermediate host. Without that intermediate host, we won't have that life cycle. But yellow grubs are most common parasite that I see around.
What other kind of parasites might we find in our pond?
Yeah, black spot disease is really common too, and that's going to be similar to that yellow grub. You're going to see black spots. It's really common in bluegill for some reason, and so you're filleting that meat, and instead of seeing like little white spots, you see black spots. An interesting thing, those black spots actually aren't a larvae. They're not an egg. It's the fish immune response causes that black coloration most of the time. So. But if you fillet it up and you see black spots on the flesh, it just looks funny more than anything. Just make sure you cook that fish. Same life cycle, similar, everything's kind of similar, just different species that causes that similar problem.
I know one time we were in northern Minnesota, or we might have actually been in Michigan when I was a kid, and we were definitely in Michigan because we were fishing in a creek or a river that flowed into Lake Michigan up by Traverse City, and we were just catching rock bass left and right. And we caught all these rock bass, or at least that's what I think they were. And we kept them. And Dad told me, now I'm going to clean these before we go home, and don't tell anybody about all these worms that are in them. And they had those black spots all over them, but then they had those little, the white grubs in them too. Yeah, they were pretty nasty and wormy. But he said, as long as we cook them, it's not going to be a big deal. Just don't tell the wives.
Exactly. It's one of those things that if you think about it too much, it really is not appetizing, but if you cook them, they're safe to eat. So I think that's the important thing.
Cool. So what else? What other kinds of parasites might we see?
I see anchor worms fairly commonly. So if you reel in a fish and it almost looks like a hair growing off of it, kind of like a half-inch or an inch long, like a really thick hair. But those are really common, called anchor worms, but they're actually not worms. They're little crustaceans, so similar to like a shrimp type deal that they get between the scales, they grab onto that skin, and they kind of just hold on tight. And so anchor worms are really common. Ick, I think a lot of us are familiar with ick if we had an aquarium growing up. And so ick is a fungus that can get on the it looks like a fungus. It's actually a protozoan parasite that can get on the fish, and it makes these like flowy white kind of stringy type deals that come off the fins a lot, or the gills. And so we see that a lot in aquariums. It's really a strong indication that the water quality is really poor. Ick seems to be common when we have really poor water quality. It can get on the gills and make it really hard for the fish to breathe. So in an aquarium or in a pond, we might see fish gulping air a lot. If you get ick into a pond, it's very hard to control. And so one of the first things we recommend is as soon as you see it, try to get every fish that visibly has ick out of that pond and get them away from that pond. You don't want them to get, decay and it wash back in the pond. So getting them away is really important. If it's a small pond, you can add salt to the water. That helps boost the immunity of the fish that are in there, making sure you're adding the right amount. But if it gets really, really bad, they make medications that you can put into the water of the pond. Make sure you understand where it's flowing and follow the recommendations on the label, obviously. But there are ways to treat it. If you get ick in a pond, it can be pretty bad pretty quickly. So, make something that we'd want to be aware of and control if we could.
So what causes parasites in ponds?
Parasites are common, like we talked about. So 40 to 50% of all species have some parasitic stage, right? And so it's common for parasites to be in a pond. A couple things that that can lead to more parasites. Having stagnant water, that can lead to more parasitism, poor water quality. And it's not necessarily that poor water quality leads to more parasites, but what it does is it stresses out the fish or the animals that are in the water. And so that lowers their immunity, right? Their immune response. And so they're not able to fight off the infections as well. And so we start to see higher amounts of parasitism than we would if the fish could be happy and healthy and their immune systems could work as we wanted it to. One of the common things I see people doing is taking fish from one area to another. They go catch them somewhere, they throw them in their pond, and that's a really easy way for parasites to get moved around. And so, I think a lot of times it's good-natured. There's a lot of reasons that we wouldn't want to transport fish from one area to another. It might be better to buy them from a reputable dealer, for example. But, those are kind of some of the common reasons that we'd see a lot of parasites in our pond.
Interesting. And just so everybody understands this, it's not legal to move most fish around, at least in Kansas.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Private pond to private pond, if they're your fish and a private entity with no flowing water from area to area, then it's legal, but most of the time it is not.
Awesome. Well, thanks for bringing this topic, Joe. I know I learned a lot today. I didn't know a whole lot of this information about parasites and everything, so I was glad to learn about it. I'm sure lots of our listeners will too. So thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll talk to you again in a couple weeks with a terrestrial episode.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. You can hear the full episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for it on your favorite podcast platform. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about reproductive issues in cattle with veterinarian in K-State's Diagnostic Veterinary Laboratory in K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Gregg, as we're thinking about reproductive issues and pregnancy loss in cattle, what are the different types of loss that they get categorized into?
We categorize them a couple ways. Number one is that we look at it as issues with the dam, issues with the sire, issues with the embryo, and then issues with the environment. So it can get really complicated. But from a veterinary standpoint, we kind of break out fetal loss into three categories. One would be, fertility. Or do we have a fertility problem where actually we're not getting conception? And then the second category is what we would call early embryonic death, which would be the loss of the fetus in the first 46 to 48 days, depending on who you're talking to. And then our definition of abortion would be fetal loss after about day 48 or day 50. Then those are called abortions. And the reason we break them out is that different diseases cause fetal attrition at different stages of gestation.
Is there a time within one of those types of loss where it's most likely to occur?
Well, we know that beef cows, at least 90% probably do conceive on any one breeding, but we know that our pregnancy rates aren't even close to that if we just had one breeding. So there is a tremendous amount of loss in that first 30 to 60 days after pregnancy.
Can we see a cow get bred, lose their calf, and then get rebred all in one breeding season?
Absolutely, and a lot of that depends on how long the breeding season is. A lot of the reasons they lose their fetus is just because the fetus didn't develop, or maybe there's a hormone issue or a protein issue. They lose the fetus, they recover, they come back in estrus, and then if there's a bull there, they'll rebreed. So absolutely that occurs.
Is that something really cattle producers likely going to be able to see or catch?
Well, they might see that these animals, they've had the bull in there for a while, and they still see some that are still coming back in heat and estrus. That gives you an indication that either they didn't get bred by the bull or they got bred and lost their fetus. Sometimes if we have an idea of when the breedings actually occurred, when we see animals come back in estrus 30 to 35 days after their last breeding, that gives us a pretty good idea that we've had an early embryonic death occur in that female.
What are some common issues that can impact cattle conceiving and then also staying pregnant?
So let's talk about the ones that are not infectious. And we're talking about fertility. The dam's body condition at calving has a huge impact on when and if she's actually going to become pregnant during the breeding season. And we know that body condition is just a proxy for nutrition. So prior to calving, nutrition is one of the keys. The other thing we always talk about is bull fertility. If a bull's not fertile, then he's going to affect the breeding season. And so that's why we recommend for most producers that they have a breeding soundness exam completed on the bull. It's rare for us to find sterile bulls, but we do find bulls routinely that are less than ideal fertility-wise, and that could have a major impact, especially if it's a single sire pasture. The other things that we might think about on there is just the age of the bull. Do they become lame or with foot rot or whatever in the pasture, and they can't service the dams or the females like they should? So that's kind of a group of non-infectious things that we see on both the dam and the sire side.
Can it ever just be too hot outside for them?
Boy, that's a great thing that I skipped on that. Absolutely. We know that heat has a major impact on fertility and the growth of the fetus. And so especially this is your herds that we deal with that are artificially inseminating, they're time breeding, and when they're doing that is in the summer, June, July, in that area, a lot of times their conception rates are low. It's not that they maybe didn't conceive, but that early embryonic death is occurring. So heat stress is a big deal both on the beef and the dairy side as far as its negative effect on reproduction.
What are a few diseases that could be causing issues?
Yeah, unfortunately, we've got a whole list of them, and we'll just start with the old boogeyman, the BVDV, and everybody knows it's a virus that causes respiratory issues, but it also can be involved in repro. And the thing about BVD, it can affect everything from fertility all the way to late-term abortions. And the way that we can prevent BVD or try is biosecurity. Don't purchase animals that have BVD. And then, of course, we want BVD in our vaccines to protect those breeding females from BVD. We have lepto, especially in certain parts of Kansas and the Midwest. We've got a major lepto out there. A lot of times when people talk about lepto, we think of late-term abortion. It does have a major effect on early embryonic death, too. So we can't really do anything biosecurity-wise because there's wildlife and other things that can carry the lepto. But what we can do is make sure that lepto is in our vaccination program. And then trick, we do have trichomoniasis breakout. It's a truly venereal disease transmitted from bull to cow and cow to bull. We do have a few cases of those in Kansas. I think we have 5 counties right now that have positive trick herds. Really the only way to prevent that is biosecurity, either having the bulls tested before they come in or buy virgin bulls and those kind of things. And then some other ones, a virus called IBR, which just like BVD is both a respiratory and a repro issue. We just need to have that in our viruses, in our vaccines. That helps prevent that. And then something we don't really talk that much about, but we see, especially in fall calving herds, are anaplasmosis, and this is typically late-term abortion. And so for that, again, it's biosecurity. Vaccine might help, so that's something producers might think about. And then the last one that I think of when I think of infectious is a bacteria called Campylobacter. In our vaccines, all our vaccines have a V initial in there. It's Vibrio, which means it's Campylobacter. They changed the name of the bacteria, so we want to make sure that V is in our vaccine, is what I'm saying. So those are the major infectious causes of I left out Neospora, which is a protozoa. You call it Neospora, I call it Neospora. But it's kind of a weird organism carried by dogs and coyotes, and I don't know how to really control that because there aren't any vaccines out there that cover that particular disease.
What's that final category that you see being a common cause of pregnancy loss?
Well, that's I just call non-infectious, and it's more of a management, environmental thing, and actually most of those are nutritional. And our big ones that we see are vitamin A, vitamin E, and selenium deficiencies in the dam. And that usually manifests itself as late-term abortions or stillborn or weak calves. And so, again, it goes back to that pre-calving nutrition. The other thing that we do talk about is trace mineral issues. We do see quite a bit of copper deficiency in particular, but also some zinc. And we do know that those trace minerals are very important as far as conception and early growth of the fetus. So, again, that goes back to a quality trace mineral pre-calving and during the breeding season. And then a couple things that are they're not. We talked about this kind of being for pasture cattle. That is more of a winter issue as far as abortion. And number one are nitrates. We see a fair amount of nitrate-caused abortions in this part of the world. And I don't see every abortion case that comes through the diagnostic lab, but I think I see most. And to my knowledge, I don't know of any cases where the dams, the pregnant animals, were showing signs of nitrate poisoning, but there was enough nitrate in their system to pass to the calf to actually cause the stillborn, basically the late-term abortion. So anytime we have an abortion, our recommendation is make sure you test the calf to make sure that it's not a nitrate abortion. And then the last one are molds. We do see a fair amount of mold-induced abortions, and it can be when we have round bales, the white smoke kind of thing that goes off there, that's mold. And sometimes if we have a high dose of that and the cow typically breathes that in, we can cause abortion. The times where we've seen the biggest wreck was when we had cow cubes or cow cake that actually became wet and then grew mold, and then we fed them to, the last time was just a few months ago, fed them to some heifers, pregnant heifers, and then we had a kind of an outbreak of a mold abortion. So it's kind of lots and lots of things can cause fetal wastage in bovine. A lot of the things we can't really diagnose. It's very, very complicated.
Do you recommend cattle producers, if they see a calf that has been aborted, they get it tested?
I do. If it's just one, then you just, it just may be just the way that it is, just normal attrition. But if we have a couple, and especially within a short period of time, then it's time to really call the veterinarian and decide whether we should start testing. The fetus is really important, but a piece of the placenta from the dam is one of the most important tissues that producers and veterinarians can submit to the diagnostic lab to get a diagnosis.
Gregg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure.
That was Gregg Hanzlicek, a veterinarian in K-State's Diagnostic Veterinary Laboratory in K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine. If you'd like to learn more about testing, you can do so at ksvdl.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As more calves are being transported off dairy farms, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that researchers are looking at how to move calves without causing stress or injury.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the transport of young calves. As we look at our dairy operations across Kansas, many of our dairy operations no longer actually raise calves on the home dairy. Calves are generally either sold to another entity or ownership is retained, and the animals are transported to another facility for growing. And the length of time that they spend at that heifer facility may be dependent on some of the other resources that the dairy has. But at the very least, as we look at transporting these animals, especially at a young age, what are some things that we should consider? Well, there's actually been some very good research that has looked into, number one, how old should animals be when they're transported? One of the studies looked at animals being moved at 28 days instead of 14. And when they did that, they saw that mortality rate dropped when we had older animals that were being moved, actually dropped from about 6% to 3% when they did that. They've also looked at calves that were transported for length of time, so how long you transport animals may be an issue that you need to consider. For those animals that were transported for 16 hours as opposed to 6 or 12, they had more issues with dehydration, also had higher rates of diarrhea and respiratory diseases when they arrived at the receiving facility. So as we think about how long we want to transport these animals, an important thing to consider is whether or not on long hauls do we need to have a rest period for these animals. And generally the rest period is considered about 8 hours. So we stop somewhere along the transport path and we unload those animals for about 8 hours. We give them a feeding of milk when they're unloaded and then right before they're reloaded. Well, you can imagine there's some transition involved when we do that as we unload animals and reload those, and those maybe don't have always the most positive effect on our animals. So the results of the study were actually kind of varied. Some things were positive in that particular study by giving a rest and other things not. Some other things that you might want to consider are what are the important things that we need to do as we manage calves so they have a successful transport. Well, number one, colostrum is still king when it comes to their immune system. So in studies that have looked at the rate of passive transfer on these animals that have been transported and received, they've found that those animals that have a higher total blood protein actually have fewer sick days and actually grow faster than those that have inadequate passive transfer. Second major thing that you need to consider is animals do need to be fed prior to transport. A couple of studies have shown that when we feed animals prior to transport, milk feeding, when they're received then at the receiving facility, they generally will have lower levels of non-esterified fatty acids, indicating that they have not started to break down fat. And as a result of that, those animals tend to do better, have higher rates of gain once received. The last thing that is very important to consider is cleanliness. You know, the trailer that we haul these animals on needs to be clean and free of things that might be harboring disease. So making sure that you start with a clean trailer when you're transporting calves is very, very important. Should not have manure and other waste left behind by older animals that could contain bacteria and other organisms that these young calves are not yet ready to try to fight off. So pay attention to the trailers that are showing up on your farm, making sure that they've been cleaned prior to arrival at your dairy. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers that are transporting young calves to consider their age at transport and some of the management things that we can do just prior to transport to improve the success of that transported animal.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.